In 3, 2, 1. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's my absolute pleasure to be able to join you on this last session of Canola Week, the last session of the last day, and to share with you some insights on the Australian canola industry. I know many of you have been to Australia and attended various conferences or even helped us on our way in establishing canola. I'll hopefully glean a little bit more information perhaps that you didn't know about the Australian canola industry during this short presentation this afternoon. We'll start by just giving a bit of an overview of the Australian Oilseeds Federation, who we are, what we do, and we are essentially the Australian oilseed industry body. We represent not only canola, but also sunflower, soybean, linseed, and safflower. And our role is to work with the whole of value chain to try to develop the industry and build value for the industry participants. We operate ourselves as somewhat of a mini-me of the Canola Council, in that we are much smaller than the Canola Council, as our industry is much smaller, but we certainly aspire to the size and the development that the Canola Council has been able to achieve over the last 30 or more years in its existence. I'd like to start by actually providing some thanks to Canada. Thanks for helping us get established, because it was in the late 60s that the first Canadian germplasm came to Australia for canola, and then really pioneered that breeding program during the 70s. But it really wasn't until the late 70s, early 80s that we really mastered the production of canola in a counter-seasonal way on the other side of the planet. And in 1983, the Canadian Canola Council registered the trademark of canola. And then in 1987, I'm proud to say I was actually the first one to use that trademark and launch the first branded canola product on retail supermarket shelves. And the Canola Council, I must give thanks to, because they unwillingly and unreservedly provided access to that trademark for the growth and development of that brand in Australia and subsequently around the world. Also want to just touch on the Australian winter production process, the way we grow our crops in Australia, look at our Australian canola production and trade, and then we'll touch on the canola issues and drivers behind those issues, and then we'll look at the future canola prospects. So the Australian canola production is pretty much, the Australian broadacre cropping production is pretty much divided into two. There's summer production and there's winter production. It's all dependent on when and where the rain falls. So in summer, it's much smaller. We have about 880,000 hectares that receive that summer rainfall. And within that, we grow sorghum primarily, cotton, which is largely irrigated, and also some corn. It's very small amounts of sunflower and soybean. But it's really the winter crop is the main game in Australia, and it's predominantly wheat. We're still at a stage in Australia where the majority of farmers will call themselves wheat farmers and put canola in the rotation, whereas I understand in Canada, you've got to the point where they're canola farmers that have wheat in the rotation. But wheat is the dominant crop. More than half the production is in wheat, followed by barley, and then just under 10% is canola, and slightly below that are pulses. And you can see here on the map how the production is spread across those southern states, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia. This is pretty much the canola growing area. We call it the wheat belt, but this is where canola grows in more of those medium to high rainfall zones. Wheat will extend into some of the drier regions. If we just look at the challenges in those early days in trying to get canola to grow in Australia, if we transpose the map of Australia latitudinally over North America, we see where Australia really fits. And we're talking about the central to southern part of the United States. And in terms of canola growing regions, you can see that canola pretty much grows within a band, I guess, stretching from Southern California across to Florida, and some of those lower Midwest states. So we're quite some distance from where the original genetics that we acquired from Canada stem from, latitudinally. So we're more a subtropical agricultural space for canola, which presents its own problems in terms of diseases and also our high dependence on rainfall, given that there is very little subsoil moisture inherent in Australian soils. If we look at our farming practice or our sowing practice and the seasonal practice, I should say, across the year with canola, it pretty much mirrors the Canadian situation. We've got we plant in late April into from early to late April is when canola is sown, with a view to harvesting it from late October through to early December. And that's pretty much the same in both countries. But if we start to look at some of the more critical variables around that, we see some quite differences. Soon after you're sown in Canada, you're looking at nearly 17 hours of daylight a day, whereas in Australia, we're looking at just under 10 hours of sunlight a day. Significant differences there. And also our temperature ranges. You're moving into a fairly mild 61 to 73 degrees Fahrenheit temperature range, whereas in Australia we're heading into winter, or at least what we would call winter, 39 to 57 degrees Fahrenheit. So quite a bit cooler. You're moving into a warmer period. We're moving into our winters. When we get to the equinox, around September 21, we're pretty much online, needless to say. We've both got about 12 hours of daylight each between Saskatoon and Wagga in Australia. But again, the temperature range is also starting to come together as the crop begins to mature in both countries. And you can see there the much closer range of temperatures that we both experience. If we look at the Australian canola production, it's quite variable. You'll see there it ranges between just under 2 million to just over 4 million tonnes, and it's up and down. And the main determinant there is actually the rainfall. We are solely a rain-fed crop. There's all but no irrigated canola underway in Australia unless it's for seed production. So in periods of drought, like we see at the end of what we call the millennial drought at the end of the 2000s, really low production below 2 million. Then we started to get some more reliable rainfall early in the decade and around the middle of the decade, give us some really good production. In fact, we achieved our record production of something like 4.2 million tonnes at that time. And then back into a drought, quite a severe drought actually the last 2 years, and this has been broken this year, much to the joys of farmers. So we're seeing a pretty average sort of production, a little over 3 million tonnes this year, and that will certainly fill the pockets of farmers. It's fair to say that after 2 years of pretty severe drought, canola wasn't necessarily their first crop of choice to go into, just because of the risks and the costs. We've seen much greater plantings of wheat, but nonetheless, canola is still playing a part in those rotations, which is pleased to see. So typically, Australia will produce between that 2 and 4 million tonnes per annum. We are highly export dependent, and we're the number 2 exporter of canola in the world. Just can't recall who the number 1 is. It's Canada, of course. And you can see in that graph there how our production versus the exportable surplus. So our demand is around 1 million tonnes per annum. So we have a small exportable surplus when we at the lower end of our production at 2 million, but when we produce 4 million and more tonnes, then we actually have quite a strong surplus for export. And where does that surplus go? Well, here are our major markets, and we're looking at the European Union being by far the largest market for us, and well over 3/4 of our crop over the last 5 years has been destined to Europe, and that is, as you would be aware, for biofuel. Our second market is Japan, third market China, followed by the United Arab Emirates and then Nepal. And we've seen this split of destinations change quite markedly over the years as demand in Europe has continued to grow, and we've been able to service that market quite competitively for us. If we look at our current issues and drivers that are impacting the Australian canola production. Firstly, at a farm level, we're seeing production variability, and what's driving that is really the climate variability. If we look at those isohyets, those lines of equal rainfall around the country, they are migrating away from the centre towards the coast. So that arable land that's sort of greater than 300 to 400 kilometres from the coast is starting to diminish, and our area available for cropping is diminishing as well. That's a real challenge for Australia, and something that a lot of work is going into adaptability for canola and other broadacre crops for more drought tolerance. We face the same challenges as the Canadians and much of the rest of the world in terms of chemical use and the restrictions that are being applied by particularly developing nations, but many nations that take more of a hazard approach to the assessment of the safety of chemicals than they do a risk-based approach. Countries like Canada, the United States and Australia very much take a risk approach to managing chemical use and MRLs, but many countries and areas such as Europe take much more of a hazard approach, which we would argue is not the most appropriate way to manage the effective production of food, because it's actually limiting the opportunity to maximise production. One of the issues that is quite unique to Australia is the high use of farmer-saved seed, and we can understand why that is the case, but sometimes up to 80% of the crop will be sown with farmer-saved seed, despite the presence of strong seed companies amongst the BASFs, the Bayers, the Cortevas, etc., and providing both Roundup Ready and hybrids, etc. But we're still seeing a very high use of farmer-saved seed, and we can understand that because of the production risk that applies in Australia. Because of that variability that we see, many growers, if not all growers, will always have some farmer-saved seed in their back pocket because of the uncertainty of what the season might present. If we sow in April, we're really not sure at that stage what the season is going to look like in terms of the ability to bring that through to a productive crop, and therefore growers will mix paddocks around. So they'll have a paddock or two of hybrid, but they'll have equally more paddocks of farmer-saved seed. Some of the issues at the trade level for us, and I think increasingly perhaps for Canada, is the increasing reliance, or the high reliance on the European Union, particularly for biodiesel. We have an advantage being able to service that market. We have a pricing advantage. We're able to supply non-GM, so we have about 20% of our crop is genetically modified, Roundup Ready, but we're able to segregate. So 80% is non-GM, and the European market takes a favour to that. We also have a good freight advantage to Europe, so there are positive reasons why we do have that reliance on Europe, but it does make us quite vulnerable. We've also seen this year, of course, the drop in biodiesel demand, or diesel demand generally, and then the knock-on to biodiesel in Europe as a result of COVID-19. This has sort of been offset to some degree this year because of the poor production in Europe and the Ukraine. So their import requirement is still quite strong, but nonetheless, the fundamental demand for diesel in Europe, while it is slowly picking up, isn't anywhere near where it was this time last year. And of course, we all face the global trade uncertainties. The move towards protectionism, we're seeing that as being a real challenge for us. And of course, appealing to the WTO often is a long drawn-out process, and in fact, one could argue that the WTO is losing its teeth in terms of being able to prosecute those cases effectively. And of course, we all face what we would perhaps regard as unreasonable actions by various markets that we sell into, which further restricts our ability to market. Canada obviously is facing some obvious challenges there, but Australia is not out in the cold either, or on its own. We face similar challenges with much of our agricultural produce and also our raw material, mineral raw materials into certain markets, which is just something we have to live with, but it certainly is challenging. But on the positive side, we see the global fats and oils consumption is rising. So that's a really positive sign for us all. We're seeing that, as we know, as developing countries move up that socioeconomic pyramid, so too their consumption of fats and oils increases, both in food and also in as a source of energy. And canola is well placed to take advantage of that. So we're riding on the positive coattail. And of course, canola itself within that oil complex ticks those health boxes. It's, as we know, low in saturated fat, high in omega-3, strong source of phytosterols, and particularly in those developing nations, where historically the oil consumption might have been oils that weren't particularly healthy, they're now seeing the opportunity that canola provides in providing a healthy oil, particularly for management of cardiovascular disease. We've also been able to demonstrate as an industry that canola is grown sustainably, both in Canada and Australia. We've had to be able to demonstrate to the European Union the greenhouse gas emission levels produced by canola production, and that just serves to reinforce the sustainable nature of canola, particularly when compared to some of the other oil seeds that might be grown in areas perhaps in less sustainable manners. And of course, the growing demand for protein meal, plant protein meal generally, canola is well placed for that. We've obviously had a long history in the animal feed area, but now an emerging opportunity in the human food sector. And, obviously well aware and watching closely the Canadian protein superhighway, the investment by the Canadian government into plant-based proteins. And canola is also benefiting from that with opportunities for improved fractionation technology. And, we're looking from an Australian perspective to get to that stage where, as a critical mass, we can justify that sort of investment in R&D in canola protein as food sources. So lots of ticks behind canola, but also some challenges that we face, and it's susceptible to a changing climate, perhaps more so than other broadacre crops. So we're vulnerable in that respect. We're also vulnerable, canola, in terms of its share of total fats and oils. We hold a good share at the moment of that global growth that I've just demonstrated, but we need to make sure we maintain our share of that global fats and oils growth trend and not lose it to other oils. We have an over-reliance on biodiesel. That's certainly a case for Australia, potentially a case for Canada. It's not underlying fundamental demand that's driving it, but rather it's government policies that is driving that demand, and therefore it's subject to change at very short notice. And then, of course, we have the challenges faced around issues like glyphosates and GM technology and other emerging breeding technologies, and trying to match the advancement of science and the necessity to be able to feed the planet with that balance of community sentiment around new technologies and existing technologies, a challenge for us all to face. So that, in a very quick nutshell, is the Australian canola industry, and a brief snapshot of its history, how we've got to this point and how we're travelling at the moment, and some of the challenges that we face in the future. And I look forward to taking your questions shortly, because there will be a Q&A after this. So I look forward to taking that. And thanks very much for your time and attention. For those that want more details, you'll probably get a copy of this presentation, and my details will be on that presentation. So once again, thanks very much for your time. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to spend some time with you, and I look forward to the Q&A coming up shortly. Thanks. That's a wrap.